Today on BRStv, we're gonna filter this tank. Hey guys, my name is Ryan. Welcome to another week of the BRS 160, where every week we do our best to help you guys, members of the reefing community, enjoy your tanks and find new ways to explore the hobby. We do that by following the setup and progression of this 160-gallon reef tank. Today we're going to discuss chemical filtration, which is a practice of using various medias to remove unwanted elements from the tank, like color pigments, odors, phosphate, carbon dioxide, ammonia, heavy metals, accidental toxins, and a variety of other contaminants. Today we're going to explore activated carbon, GFO, resin, CO2 removal media, and zeolites. We'll share what they're for, some performance data, as well as some of the various methods of implementing them in the aquarium. Before we get too far into this, I'd like to say the best way to maintain a low nutrient, low contaminant tank is to limit the amount of things we put in the tank with foods and additives, and then effectively remove them with a solid water change schedule. All of these medias are effective and safe, but almost every experienced reefer will tell you that limiting the amount of medias to those you find particularly valuable is generally a good idea for the tank, because they all have some unknown or unintended effects on the water chemistry. For the most part, there just isn't a better replacement for a solid water change schedule, but these medias have some undeniable results and why some reefers use them as a component of their overall tank maintenance schedule. Let's start with activated carbon, which is by far the most popular filter media, probably by a magnitude of 5-to-1 over other media types, and that's because it simply does some things that are difficult to achieve unless you have an incredible water change schedule. The biggest one being removal of undesirable color pigments, but also odors, dissolved organics, and food from waste and algae breaking down over time, as well as accidental or unintended toxins. Yellowing pigments are probably the biggest reason. Not only do they give the tank and corals a dull, unattractive look, but it also significantly impacts PAR. We filled our PAR testing station with some dirty water from one of the tanks here at the BRS office, which admittedly doesn't get the best maintenance, and took PAR readings at 18 inches with one of the industry's most popular LED lights, the Radion XR15. At 18 inches deep, the highest PAR we saw from the XR15 in the dirty tank was 93. The average PAR at all 36 points was just 40. Most of you are probably expecting much higher PAR ratings than this. After we added some ROX carbon in a reactor and let it run overnight, you can visually see how much clearer the water was at 12 hours, at which point the highest PAR rating more than doubled to 220, and the average of all 36 points also more than doubled to 87. End of story. If you spent $400 to buy one of the most advanced and best LED lighting options in our industry, it just doesn't make any sense to let yellowing pigments in the water impact performance so dramatically when just a few bucks in carbon almost completely solves the issue. Now, most of you that aren't using carbon already are probably thinking, well, my tank isn't that yellow. The tank we took this water from admittedly doesn't have the best maintenance schedule, so if you have a really excellent maintenance schedule, your tank might not be as yellow. One easy way is to turn the lights off during the day, where it's easier to see the yellow tint, or even use a PAR meter like the Senai or Apogee to take measurements before and after your next water change. For those of you that don't own a PAR meter and want to know how this is impacting your tank, the easiest way is to pick up a white container about the same depth as your tank, like a white 5-gallon bucket, and fill it with water from your tank next to another container with fresh salt water. If you don't use carbon, you're likely going to be pretty surprised how yellow your water is. If it's the same pristine blue as the new salt water, it's a real testament to your excellent maintenance and feeding habits, and you should be pretty proud. It's hard to believe, but running just a bit of carbon in the tank will remove so many of these pigments that within a day, your tank's water will be basically visually indistinguishable from freshly mixed salt water. Most of us have spent hundreds to thousands not only selecting the right lighting solution for our tanks, but many of us have also put a lot of effort into tuning our lighting solution's PAR output to our desired windows. It just seems silly to mess all that up when just a few bucks of carbon can keep the PAR output and coloration in the tank stable. So which carbon type and implementation achieves the best results? Even though they all look like tiny black rocks, they're not all the same. A lot of them are made from different source materials like coal, wood, peat, coconut shells, or even blends. Each one is known for having different pore sizes, which are better at removing different elements. Most reefers also want a harder, low dust carbon and the least amount of impurities. In the aquarium, we're primarily concerned about large pores, which are the most efficient at removing large molecules like color pigments and dissolved organics. Some brands list on the packaging what the carbon's made of, but the most common by far is bituminous coal carbon, mainly because it's low cost, fairly hard, and low in dusty fines. Bituminous coal is, however, mostly comprised of smaller pores, which don't work all that well in aquariums. Lignite coal-based carbon is mostly large pores and much more efficient in the aquarium. However, it's also a lot softer, so there's going to be significantly more dusty finds, which some reefers want to avoid. There are also proprietary blends of carbon which combine the benefits of a wide array of carbon sources like the BRS ROX 0.8. This carbon has a mix of pore sizes with a heavy emphasis on large pore sizes and performance in fluids. To help give everyone a better visual idea of the impact of these pore sizes, we set up this demo station. The carbon industry's most widely accepted tests for large and medium-sized pores are known as the methylene blue and molasses efficiency test, where a known amount of each is added to a heated solution and tested against a known standard. The molasses efficiency test is the most important to reefers because it's representative of the large pores within a carbon's network, and the methylene blue is indicative of the lesser important medium-sized pores. For the most part, reefers don't need to be overly concerned about the smaller pores, which are too small to remove most of the things we're concerned about in the aquarium. We used 200 grams of carbon in a BRS media reactor in each segment of the test. To that we added a teaspoon of blackstrap molasses and 10 milliliters of methylene blue. The first chamber contains the ROX 0.8, which has that wide array of pore sizes and, not surprisingly, quickly and efficiently removes both of the contaminants from the water, resulting in pristine water virtually indistinguishable from the RODI water we started with. As expected, the large pore lignite strips out all of the important large molecules but leaves some of the medium-sized blue molecules behind. We use a special bituminous carbon here at BRS which maintains the hardness and low dust content bituminous is known for, but has a higher content of larger pores than most bituminous. You can see it removes virtually all of the medium-sized molecules, but the yellow tint indicates a significant amount of the larger molecules are left in the water. In the last chamber, we added something a bit different with the large bituminous pellets, which are surprisingly common in our industry. These large pellets are really designed for removing contaminants from air or gas and perform really poorly in fluids, particularly if they're produced from standard bituminous coal. These large pellets are typically less dusty and easy to work with, but you can see the performance in the aquarium is likely going to be pretty poor. In relation to that, for the most part, smaller granules are also going to perform better, and why we stock lignite in small and large granule, but be aware that while the small particles do perform a lot better, they're really dusty and harder to work with, and why the larger particles are so much more popular. The ROX 0.8 is also pelletized, but they're tiny little pellets designed specifically to work well in fluids. They're also super hard, so there's almost no dusty finds in ROX, and it rinses in seconds. Last piece of all this is impurities. All of these carbon source materials are mined from the ground or come from organic materials like coconut shells and peat. They're all safe for the aquarium, but some will have more impurities than others. The ROX carbon's been washed in hydrochloric acid and rinsed to remove as many impurities as possible, and the primary purpose for ROX is really for the pharmaceutical industry, where the standards are exacting in terms of contaminant removal, as well as containing as little impurities as possible. End of story, all of them are suitable for the aquarium, and I personally feel comfortable using any of them, but if the best performance, lowest dust, and least extractables or impurities are the priority, ROX 0.8 is the obvious solution. There are two ways to run carbon in a tank: a simple media bag placed in a high flow area of the sump, or a reactor which continually circulates water through all the media. All of these will work well, but to give you an idea of the differences, we set up another molasses and methylene blue test with a BRS reactor and a filter bag with 200 grams of carbon, as well as a filter bag with twice as much carbon and 400 grams. Not surprisingly, the reactor removed most of the contaminants in just 75 minutes, and at this point you might be pretty disappointed with the media bags, but we let them run for a total of 8 hours, and the results came in much closer to the reactor than you might expect. There's no question a reactor does a better job of polishing the water, but if you don't have the room or budget for a reactor, you should know a simple filter bag is obviously a very effective solution as well. Last bit on carbon: how much to use and when to change it. How much you use is going to depend on the quality and type of carbon. Obviously, if you use large pellet bituminous carbon, you're probably going to have to use 5 times as much as something like the ROX. So I'd check the manufacturer's recommendations and then check its performance with that white bucket test we discussed when you do water changes, and adjust the amount used to match the amount of food you add to the tank, as well as your other maintenance habits. I also share that even though some manufacturers will suggest their carbon will last months, the vast majority of its effectiveness is going to be in the first few days. After that, the pore network gets fouled with organics and biofilm from the tank, as well as potentially reaching its pore capacity. It's much wiser to use a small amount of carbon and change it every couple weeks than a large amount and change it every couple months. Two important steps when using carbon in the aquarium are proper rinsing and securing it tightly, both of which will prevent the release of dusty fines into the tank. If you're using a filter bag, make sure to just let the water flow through the bag to flush those loose fines off the surface. Tendency is often to try and wash them by agitating the granules with a back and forth grinding approach, which is absolutely something you should avoid at all costs. This grinding is just going to create new fines. We're just rinsing the carbon. Lignite carbon in particular has a lot of dusty fines, so it might take a couple of minutes to get them all out. For that reason, it's much more common to use ROX or bituminous carbon in a filter bag like this. If you use a reactor, rinsing is easy with any type of carbon. Just remove the output, place it in a bucket, and turn on the feed pump. Let it run until output runs clear and return the reactor's output to the sump or tank. One note on reactors, make sure you can get one that can hold the carbon in place. It's super important that carbon is not allowed to tumble around because that tumbling action will grind the carbon to dust over time and release carbon fines into the tank. The BRS reactors cartridges hold that carbon in place with sponges. The BRS Mini holds about 3/4 a cup of carbon in a great carbon-only solution for most tanks. The Mini small cartridge and foam pad does a great job of securing that carbon in place. For larger reactors, the Vertex RXU is a great carbon option because there's a cap you can slide down and lock in place to hold your carbon securely. The next most popular filter media is easily GFO, which reduces phosphate in the aquarium. Most reefers know reducing phosphate will limit algae growth, but what many miss is a fairly dramatic impact that it can have on stunting coral growth. Let's start with fighting an existing algae outbreak or preventing them altogether. Again, solid feeding habits and water changes are the best measure for this, but that understood, GFO is an incredible tool for fighting most types of algae. Algae requires nitrate, sunlight, and phosphate to grow, and limiting any one of these things can drastically reduce algae growth. Lighting in a reef tank is obviously not desirable to limit in most cases, and getting nitrates down low enough that there are limiting factors possible, but much more complex. GFO, on the other hand, is super easy to implement, and a relatively small amount of media like this can keep phosphate levels so low it's difficult for algae to take hold and become an issue. In fact, in many cases, it works so well that it can mask issues associated with really poor feeding and maintenance habits. The tank is supposed to look like crap when your nutrients are out of control. However, the liberal use of GFO and tight phosphate control can often keep it looking pristine from an algae perspective, even though the nitrates are through the roof. You may not notice until the livestock begins to deteriorate or die. I will note that there are some forms of algae that find a way to out-scavenge GFO for phosphate or simply don't need that much to survive. BRStv is one of those where it seems almost impossible to starve out regardless of how low the nutrients get. So there are two ways to implement GFO, either as a preventative measure, which we would recommend, because when it comes to algae outbreaks, an ounce of prevention is worth like 300 pounds of cure. Once an algae outbreak has taken hold, it's way harder to get things back in control than preventing it in the first place. The second approach is, of course, trying to treat that existing outbreak. The main issue with that is the large volume of algae is likely already scavenging much of the phosphate faster than the GFO can. It's also going to take a lot more GFO to remove elevated phosphate levels that have built up over months or even years than it takes to maintain already low levels. My best advice in this case is to physically remove as much algae from the tank as possible by hand, which completely removes the organics and nutrients they contain from the tank permanently. Then do a series of 5 or so 30% water changes a few days apart, which will completely remove the nutrients from the water, and then use GFO to maintain these new low levels. Many people attempt to skip the water changes and physical removal and rely only on GFO. However, as the algae begins to starve out, it's going to die and break down into nitrate and phosphate, which is released back into the tank, and the algae is going to continually bind up some portion of the new nutrients added with the daily food additions. Net result is you're going to use a ton of GFO this way, and it might take a while to win this battle. Really attacking algae means permanently removing the algae and its nutrients from the tank and then preventing a new problem with a nutrient control solution, which can include GFO. The other piece tied to this is phosphate higher than natural levels will result in phosphate incorporating itself into the calcium carbonate crystals that make up many coral skeletal structures. This effectively poisons the surface and makes it much more difficult for the coral to lay down new calcium and carbonate ions and grow. Net effect is if you have high phosphate levels, your stony corals are almost certainly going to grow significantly slower, which basically none of us want. Implementing GFO in the tank is pretty simple. Like carbon, you can throw some in a bag and place it in a high flow area of the sump. However, due to the nature of what we're trying to achieve here, which is consistently low nutrients, and we want to remove them before the algae has a chance to, means we need an efficient and rapid method of removal. This is where the GFO reactor comes in. A GFO reactor pumps water through the media. However, there's one significant difference. The GFO reactor is designed to tumble the media. Tumbling doesn't make the media perform better, it just prevents the GFO from solidifying into a solid brick. If they're not moving, the GFO particles will bind together and clog the reactor. In an ideal world, they wouldn't be tumbling because any two surfaces grinding against each other 24 hours a day will create some amount of dusty fines released into the tank. It's not going to harm anything in most cases, but we'd obviously like to avoid that if we can. We can limit that by adjusting the flow rate down. All we really need is each particle to turn over a handful of times a day. Another option is just to mix the GFO and carbon together. Doing this, we're using the carbon particles to separate the GFO particles from each other so they don't adhere to each other. Doing this allows us to not tumble the GFO, which means less dusty fines and tuning as well. There are also some resin medias out there which are also designed to remove similar types of contaminants as GFO and carbon, but in a different way. The resins act somewhat similar to your DI resin in your RODI system, where the small beads have an affinity for some types of contaminants. It's somewhat difficult to really discuss these because none of the manufacturers state what type of resin they're using, so it's really impossible to check the science behind the claims. I do wish I could provide more details, but the team here at BRS doesn't personally use a lot of resin-based products in their tanks, and the best I could get out of anyone here on the team was, yeah, I tried that one for a while, but I stopped because it wasn't doing a whole lot. I couldn't justify the cost, or there are just better medias or methods out there. I will say that some of the resin products likely work really well in freshwater tanks, but depending on the contaminant you're trying to remove, using resin in a seawater environment has some significant challenges because saltwater has such a high volume and wide variety of ions in the water, which can almost instantly deplete many of the resins the moment it touches seawater. That said, I'm sure some work is designed. The best advice I can give is go with a brand that you trust. The description is definitive on what it does, and the claims are not impossible or unlikely, and the reefing community generally supports. By support, I mean not just a lot of people have used it and say it seems okay. I mean reefers who have used a variety of different methods and found this one to be the best for them, and hopefully has some logic, experience, or even better, some plausible theories or science to back it up. One of the filtration medias many reefers don't think about is CO2 scrubbing medias, which can increase the pH of your tank, which general accepted theory and a lot of anecdotal evidence suggests will help grow corals faster. The one nice thing about media like this is it's one of the few ways to raise the pH of the tank without impacting alkalinity or other elements of water chemistry. Implementation generally is a reactor like the BRS universal air filter and some CO2 media on the intake of your skimmer. This will reduce the CO2 content of the air being mixed with the water in your skimmer and increase the pH of the tank. I will say this is really a completely optional piece of equipment and really there for those that have already implemented basically everything else and looking for some of the final frontiers, but it's a cool option, a great solution for a challenge which can sometimes be hard to solve with other methods. If you do implement this, note that some of the skimmers will pull a lot more air than others, and you might want to divert a portion of the air through the media, and a filter like this will also impact the amount of air intake to some degree. Last filtration media we're going to discuss today is those designed to remove ammonia. In general, we do not recommend ammonia removal medias in a saltwater tank because it's so easy to process ammonia with the bacteria. These medias also starve the bacteria, which deplete the beneficial bacteria population, which is okay if you're religious about replacing the media on time, but if you forget, it'd be pretty easy to get an unhealthy spike of ammonia in your reef tank. That said, there's one exception to this, and that's Zeovit. Zeovit works on a variety of concepts, but one of them is a zeolite media absorbs ammonia directly, which basically removes the nutrients before they have a chance to break down into nitrate. There's also a biological element that works in unison with this to produce an ultra-low nutrient tank, which is almost always pretty stunning and avoids most algae issues. The reason I make an exception for Zeovit is because it's so widely used and tied to a proven system that produces undeniable and replicable results. There are a lot of ways to maintain a successful ultra-low nutrient reef tank, but most of them are still trial and error, and none of them have the same robust community of successful users. Zeovit is a pretty huge topic and something we'll cover in more detail in a couple of weeks. Okay, so what are we going to install for filter media on the BRS 160? This is not going to be the most impressive thing we've ever done, but it's simple and effective, which is where I like to focus most of my efforts. We're going to use a deluxe BRS reactor with the silicone upgrade kit and run it off the manifold. The reason we went with the BRS reactor over larger reactors is because the cartridge makes it super easy to change the media. The reactor's small, inexpensive, and frankly, it's by far the most popular type of media reactor we sell, probably by a magnitude of around 10x. We went with a mix of 1/3 GFO and 2/3 carbon. I'm going to monitor the tank and adjust the amount used and likely change it out every couple weeks. One of the downsides with this implementation is a carbon exhaust before the GFO, so I'm wasting the GFO to some degree, but the benefits of this type of install make it worthwhile to me. That wraps up filtration media. As always, I hope you learned something new about how to use or some of the benefits associated with the various filtration medias. If you did, hit the thumbs up button or subscribe. Next week we'll have mechanical filtration, and just a hint at what we'll cover, I guarantee the Thelene roller mat is going to make the discussion. See you next week with week 25 of the BRS 160 mechanical filtration.